Vice President Kamala Harris' campaign promises have been called communist. The media says that's ridiculous. That's just a MAGA Trump talking point. Jack Posobiec is a Navy veteran and a popular conservative voice on X, and his recent book, Unhumans, is a strongly worded warning about the dangers of communism, specifically how it creeps into a society and takes hold of it in a way you don't see coming until it's too late. In fact, he tells how history has reframed certain leaders who fought against communism. I've been wanting to speak to him for a while. He joins us today. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. What can I say? I'm a big fan of Redacted. I think they say long time, first time. So I think that's kind of how I feel right now.
Amazing. Okay, hopefully not the last time. So first of all, can you break it down for us? What is the threat of communism and how do you see it playing out in American politics right now?
Yeah, sure. It's actually really simple, Natalie. So basically, communism is the weaponization of greed and the weaponization of hatred for and envy, specifically envy and greed. So the idea is that there's always going to be times in society where there are people who say, you know, there are those who have more than me, and I wish that I had more. And certainly this is something that's endemic to human nature, and it cuts across all societies, it cuts across all cultures. It's always something that is part of humanity. And you can take that in a philosophical route, you could take that a religious route, but a lot of people agree that these feelings do exist. And I think they inherently do. And so the danger of using this for weaponization in politics is when people come in and say, if you want these things, then you can get up and take them. You can get up and take them from those who have more than you. You can get up and take them from those who not earn them, by the way. Earn is completely different. This is vindictive. This is angry. This is petty. It is grievance-based primarily, and it is always, always, always based on tearing down those who, for lack of a better term, have built things in the world, have accomplished things in the world, have gone out and done things in the world. And so when you get leaders who tap into this vein in the human psyche and then turn it against others in society, we've seen throughout history the absolute horrors that have come from it. It always ends in mass graves. It ends in piles of skulls. It ends in severe economic destruction. And oh, by the way, for the have-nots that they claim to be helping, they're typically ending up in a worse position than they were even under whatever the previous system was. And so when we see the dangers inherent in when people engage in these types of politics for short-term political gain, we can already see this happening throughout the West and now more and more increasingly in the United States.
So the way it's playing out in Kamala Harris's proposals for the economy is very much strengthen the government, give the government all the power to decide what you buy, who buys what, make sure that the wealthiest are regulated but it's a ruse, right? Because it will make some people very powerful and wealthy, and it will make the rest of us dependent on the government. But it's being sold under this bill of goods as equality. Now, you point out how this played out for the Bolsheviks. Can you just sort of give us that cautionary tale and how you see this economically being sold under this faux empowerment?
Oh, sure. So now the Bolsheviks, so typically when we break down in the book in Unhumans that we basically put it down this way. The communism is a tactic. It is not an ideology. It's not a philosophy the way people understand it. It's actually a tactic to rabble rouse and then to use that rabble to throw against whatever the existing order of a country or society is, to destabilize it and then erect new powers, new controllers, new players to take over whatever that government is. And it typically plays out in in two stages. One is what we call OPE, or operational preparation of the environment, and then the next stage is the actual revolution of it itself. We're actually now in the revolution stage. So the operational preparation of the environment, and as a prior military intelligence officer, that this is something that we would learn is basically the idea of conducting operations prior to your actual operation. So basic changing the environment, changing systems, shaping the field of battle for your needs and for your interests, so that when you do commit to action, that you will be in a favorable position to do so. And so when we talk about that, what we see first, we break it down into three stages. The first is the separation, second is the messaging, and third is infiltration. So separation. Who are the targets for our revolution going to be? So we pick our targets, we go throughout a society, and we say, okay, it's going to be the people who and typically, by the way, when we see with the left or the regime politics in the collective West right now, it's not usually economic. And so typically, when I give these interviews, we've been talking more about cultural Marxism, because that's been the watchword of the new types of Marxism. However, in the last week or so, Kamala Harris, directly through her campaign, has dipped back into even the classical economic communism, because she's adding on to it. So some of the groups that have been targeted, obviously religious groups, Christians, white males in general, anyone who is, a less than subservient man, people who have money, people who are engaged in crypto, people who are walking outside of the mainstream financial institutions and the financial system, and of course, anyone who stands against the goals of the globalist collective West are then targeted, or you're smeared as someone who is a traitor to your country and things like this, because you stand against the globalist agenda. And so now,
but it's clever though. I just want to add this, because I think the way that it's so cleverly spun is that it's spun as the patriarchy. It's only good for this certain amount of people. And actually, I didn't understand how I was rooting against capitalism until I read Carol Roth's book about the pandemic, when I thought, wait a minute, she's totally right. I see these onesies at Target talking about down with the patriarchy. What that is a reframing of communism in an empowering way, when you have to look at it and say, but I benefit from capitalism. My whole family, my whole life does. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I got excited about that.
It's a perfect example, because one of the issues that they've had in applying communism to the West is that really the free market system has been very successful. The Soviet Union fell in the early 1990s, so like 91, 92. So the free market system has been pushed across the globe, and even the Chinese Communist Party have adopted, by and large, many elements of the market economy. Just obviously none of the political openness of the West. And so what we've seen is a change in communism, moving away from the classical Marxist model of economics, but using the same tactic as always that you just described. And what I'm saying, you're dividing the country into the oppressor versus oppressed model. So there must always be an oppressor. So the oppressor must be systemic racism, the patriarchy, the Catholic Church, whatever authority figure group you need to rail against. And then you go to your oppressed class. And your oppressed class, you go to them and say, look at these people, they're oppressing you. Follow me, and I will lead you against them. Now, in the case of the Soviet Russia, which you mentioned, of course, the obvious target was the Romanov family and the Russian Empire and the dynasty. And what they'll do, and people always ask me this, to say, well, weren't there actual grievances? Wasn't there the system of serfdom in Russia? It's like, yes, there was actually. There were legitimate grievances. And so this becomes a flashpoint for the Bolsheviks and for Lenin. So when Lenin comes up, he isn't talking about, patriarchy and equity and systemic racism and these things, but what does he say? He says peace, land, bread. So this is the messaging phase that I was talking about. So the message then becomes peace, land, bread. If you join with me, we will get peace, land, bread. And then what does he do? He infiltrates all throughout Russian society. And he's funded by the Germans, by the way, total German agent, which is why peace, by the way, is a huge plank of theirs, because Russia at the time was in a war with Germany that we call World War I. And it had been going much better than the communists would say. But that's one of the things that Germany realized. Instead of fighting a two-front war, they said, well, why don't we just destabilize Russia and fund all these radicals and get them to start a civil war within Russia, and then we can knock them out. So it was a regime change operation, by the way, from the Germans, the same type of regime change operations we see always run by the collective West, that actually unleashed radicals taking over a country and then sending that country down a perpetual spiral that we know as the Soviet Union, where we saw mass slaughter of essentially what are the kulaks. And so the kulaks became the target after the Romanovs. And so the Romanov family, everybody knows, I think, but it bears saying, and of course we talk about this in Unhumans, the entire family was slaughtered. The women, the children of the Romanovs were stabbed, they were bayoneted, they were shot in the head. Even little Prince Alexei, the youngest member of the family, in a basement out in the woods where they dragged them to. And so there was no prison. It was mass slaughter and killing. And then once they ran out of Romanovs, they needed a new group to rail against, because again, to keep in power, they always have to have a group that they're calling the oppressors. And so they moved it down a rung, and communism never stays at just the 1%. Then it moves to, we think the kulaks are the ones who are actually the oppressors in society now, because we still haven't achieved our utopia. And what's a kulak? Well, for lack of a better term, a kulak might be what we call today a small business owner, someone who has a second house, someone who has an Airbnb. The middle class, someone who has maybe you have a home that you rent, something that, those people, I don't think by anyone's terms would be considered rich. They wouldn't be considered the 1%. You wouldn't be considered, someone who's like fantastically wealthy or anything like this. But of course, you would be targeted because, you're a landowner and no one is allowed to own land and no one is allowed to own property. And you're exploiting your tenants and you're exploiting those who are subject to your whims. And so then they get targeted next. And anyone who rails against this, anyone who goes against the confiscation of their property, anyone who goes against or speaks out against the political commissars running throughout society, well, guess what? You get sent to something called the gulags. And we've already seen this, by the way, with the squatters situation in New York City here today. This is classic communist play to say that someone who does not have a contract with you can enter your property and then gain rights to your home, a home that you own, if you are not evicting them. But then the government will come in and say that if you haven't evicted them for 30 days, then it becomes theirs and you have no right to evict them. This is a classic communist play again. So they're taking people who are that they describe as the have-nots and empowering them and weaponizing them against anyone who's got a little bit of money, anyone who's got, again, who's attained that middle class household. And by the way, the word bourgeoisie, if you look it up in the original French, we tend to say bougie and we use it as slang to sort of mean like something that's very, very high end today. But if you actually look up the original word of bourgeoisie, because remember, France back then, and we call this a proto-communist revolution in the book, France had the aristocracy. So aristocracy already was a word and a class that the French knew. The bourgeoisie was not the aristocracy. The bourgeoisie meant the middle class. That's what the word actually uses. That's the word actually means in French.
So it was an attack on the middle class. Now, we don't have enough time to talk about these, but I want to let people know that when you read this book, you are forced to ask yourself, okay, wait, is that person history told me was the bad guy? What do I actually know about that for myself? So some of the people you take on, Marie Antoinette, Senator McCarthy, General Franco, Augusto Pinochet, and I found myself kind of reeling because you say they were anti-communist leaders that history has then denigrated, and you try to retell those stories. And it felt like, oh my gosh, you just ripped the rug right from under me, and I didn't know those things. Now, I myself, having lived in Portugal, had the same experience studying Salazar when I read all of these books about him, and I thought, wait, when does he get bad? What did he do to be canceled from history? So it's very interesting, and I found myself thinking, where do I go to?
Very close to including Salazar in the book.
Oh, okay. I could talk a blue streak about Salazar. We won't do that right now. And one of your quotes from General Franco is, "Wherever I am, there will be no communism." And that has become a bit of a manifesto throughout the book. One of the things I really want to ask you, though, is that watching the DNC this week, I think to myself, do those people know what they're championing for? For instance, watching Obama speak, I think, don't they know he murdered people in Libya and Syria?
I was there. I
was
in the room. I was in the room when Obama and Michelle were speaking.
Right. And so I'm just kind of thinking, watching these people, do you think they're just well-intentioned and not studying for the rights that they are championing to be taken from them? Is that your take on that?
So I think that there's an interesting clip that I saw earlier today where I think it was during one of the these roll calls that they're doing, and they're doing these roll calls of the different states. And there was a delegate who got up, and her name is Olivia Juliana. And one of the things that she stated during this roll call from the floor of the DNC was, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that to me is a full-on depiction of exactly what I've been saying, that they claim that their movement is rooted in peace and justice and equality and righting the wrongs of history and righting the wrongs of society, and they're the crusaders. But she's essentially letting the cat out of the bag, that what it is they do, when they say eat the rich, they really mean that. And when they say rich, they're talking about people like you, people like the middle class. They're defining it in a way that I don't think any of us would define it. And when they say eat, they actually do mean tear down, destroy, imprison, and in some cases, or they would not mind if people lost their lives. And as we've seen throughout history, people will lose their lives if we go down this road. And so do I think that everyone there has these beliefs? Not necessarily, but I do think, though, one of the sort of social experiments that I did while I was there was I was walking around trying to see if I could get anyone to denounce the assassination attempt on President Trump. So he's obviously he's been targeted by them. I think he's mentioned more than any other policy at the DNC. That Trump was you're hearing more about Trump. I think I heard more about Trump at the DNC than I did at the RNC. And I was walking around for almost an hour, and I could only find one person who said that he denounced it. Every single other person would hear me and then just walk away when I brought it up. But you guys are against political violence, right? You talk about J6, you talk about Charlottesville, you talk about all these things. You're against political violence, right? And so they, at the core, and this is something people have to understand, is they view anyone who's not on board with them as standing in the way of their goals, standing in the way of their movement, standing in the way of the revolution, standing in the way of their utopia. And in Mao's China, in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and I lived in China for several years, I speak Mandarin, and when you see those signs that were depicted under the necks and the heads of the individuals who were put on struggle session in these giant arenas or soccer stadiums, and the crimes that are listed under them typically will say something like right-wing extremist or anti-revolutionary extremist. So the enemies of the revolution are always smeared as extremists, are always smeared as purveyors of disinformation. And this is a communist tactic that has been used for over a century. And so what we're trying to do in the book is explain that these types of tactics have been used before. We are now seeing them being unleashed right now in real time, and give people a playbook to understand what's going on, and then also sort of a counter playbook to fight back.
Right. And so some liberal voices, including a piece in the Washington Post this week, say, well, Trump is accusing Kamala Harris of having communist policies, but this is not the flex that he thinks it is, because people are not concerned about it and they don't understand. So what you're pointing out is the thread that runs through communist societies that we are championing. So I want to thank you for coming on Redacted. And yeah, I'm going to suggest that people read this book, because not only do you have these cultural warnings, but also the end of the book has suggestions on how you can fight this in your own society, how you can champion this in wherever you live. So you can follow Jack on X. It's Jack, let's see, here it is, at Jack Poso, right? No. What is your Twitter? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so Jack Posobiec or Jack Poso. Just go on next. Look up Poso. You'll find me.
You're gonna find him. Yeah, you're popular on that platform, so that's why I was so excited.
By the way, if you can't find me, just go over to Media Matters and the SPLC and any far left blog and their Right Wing Watch, and they're constantly talking about me. I think they've actually done more, and even the former Biden campaign did more to promote my book than even conservative media did. So I want to thank them for getting us on the New York Times bestseller list.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, I hope you come back on Redacted another time.
I'd love to. Thanks so much, Natalie.